Thank you so much for being here and welcome. This is our very first webinar under Rise Results after we rebranded last month. So we're grateful you're here. We're super excited to have Dr. Angela Jackson and Marilyn here to sit on this panel. But before we get started, we'll do a few housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded and and it'll be housed on our website. So Alicia will put that the link to our website in the chat. Also, the chat will be open. We're going to reserve about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A. So you can put your questions in the chat and or in the Q&A. That would be great. So to get started, thank you for being here again. These are undeniably challenging times that we're living in. I believe that the pandemic was kind of the defining crisis of our era, something that we would adjust to and then move beyond. But I've come to realize the current climate and the challenges we're facing today are just as complex and equally difficult to navigate. So with this webinar today, it's our first one in a series. So stay tuned to our LinkedIn page and our webpage to see the ones coming up. But these series our goal is to inform, inspire, and equip you with practical strategies so you can move forward and support employees and companies, and then build those communities where people feel like they belong. So with that, I will make a few introductions. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Angela Jackson with us today. She is a Harvard professor and CEO of the Future Forward Strategies. And she is the author of a best-selling book called The Win-Win Workplace. I think Marilyn has it on her desk too.
I love it, and I have it behind me.
There you go, three on the screen. Alicia will put the link in the chat later on to if you're interested in purchasing this book. She's the author of The Win-Win Workplace: How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Success. And many of you probably know Marilyn Nagel. She is the co-founder of Rise Results. She is the former CDO of Cisco, the first CDO of Cisco, and also a pioneer in the space of DEI and culture engagement. So with that, let's get started. Let's just dive in. So Angela, congratulations again on your book. It's an incredible success. It's on the New York Times, LA Times, and USA Today bestseller list. And that speaks to companies wanting to know how to cultivate high-performing, employee-centered workplaces. So tell us what inspired you to write The Win-Win Workplace.
Yeah, and Kim, I just want to thank you and Marilyn again for setting the table for this conversation. Um, the Win-Win Workplace actually started right before the pandemic, my research. So I was leading a $50 million investment in employees who had barriers to work, who were thinking about career transitions. This is 2019. And thinking about how they could land jobs in the future that weren't estimated to be automated. And then in 2020, like you mentioned, the pandemic, overnight, we saw people lose their jobs in fields and hospitality, transportation, frontline. And we thought in the moment we had some solutions that could help get these people back to work. And so people were upskilled, they were retrained, they were placed in jobs. And then me, along with my research team, 6 months later, went back to check in on them. And what we found was very interesting. We had one set of workers who were excited about their transition, the new field that they were in, thinking about how they were advancing to management. There was another set of employees that we went to who were actually had already transitioned out the organization and was thinking about what's next. And we got curious about what were the differences in these workplaces. And what those differences were, we were able to identify 9 strategies of how the companies where people stayed, how they were investing in their talent. And then we got curious in talking to CFOs, and we learned from those CEOs how these programs and these investments, how they actually showed a correlation to lift on the financial side. And that research, we began talking to over 1,700 companies to figure out, does this hold true across companies? Which sectors do these strategies work better in? And what did that ROI really look like? And really trying to build that economic case around investing in talent. Yes, because it's good for the employees, but also because it's good for the business, hence the win-win.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing So much great information in your book. I encourage everybody to pick it up. I'll switch gears a little bit to Marilyn, but to get your perspective, having worked inside a corporation as a CDO and consulting with our clients at Rise Results, how do you see the difference between meritocracy and diversity, and how can companies leverage meritocracy in redefining their work?
Sure. And this is a conversation we've been having with several companies. And people, as we saw that initial presidential order that talked about meritocracy and doing away with the notion of DEI, we see meritocracy has been part of our work foundationally since its inception. And I've probably been doing this work since this work started, when it was just diversity, then inclusion, then belonging and equity were all added to the mix. The thing is, it's not an either or, it's really a both and. So diversity is the mix of difference. And difference can be difference in, we're three people, we're all women, but we all come from different backgrounds, we're different ages, we're different placement in our family, we have different experiences. So diversity is the difference that we all bring to the table, our different way of thinking and our backgrounds, etc., and who we are. Meritocracy is how we rise to the top. And our work has always been about supporting meritocracy by removing the barriers to advancement. And that could be barriers to promotions, barriers to being hired, barriers to getting into a leadership development program. And often those are based or rooted in unintentional biases or other old systems and processes that did not consider consequences around excluding people. And so when we go in and work with companies to remove those barriers, what we're doing is promoting meritocracy. What we're doing is saying, if we remove these barriers, everyone has equal access, and naturally the best will rise. A meritocratic system will ensue. We always also say, when people are involved, there's no way you can have a pure meritocracy, because we're human beings. And so we can be fully well-intentioned, we can be completely educated about our own biases, but we're humans. And we're going to say, I really like working with Angela and I want her on my team. And that's going to have an impact on my selection for people I want to work with on my team. So we work toward meritocratic systems. We remove barriers. We want diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds, etc. They're not mutually exclusive, and one doesn't depend on the other, but we recognize the human factor in both.
Absolutely. And Marilyn, I mean, if I've heard you say it once, I've heard you say it 1,000 times about hiring the best person. You always hire the most qualified person for the job.
And that's always been, we have never said sacrifice diversity, because that does a disservice to that person you hire. If you hire a woman in a senior executive role who is not qualified, overqualified candidates who are absolutely more qualified for the job, there's a good likelihood that you're setting that woman up for failure. And then everyone says, you see, we weren't ready for a woman in that role. And so it doesn't serve the person who you're putting in, and it doesn't serve the organization. So we always say, cast a wider net, make sure that you help prepare everyone to move up. That's the removal of the barriers. If your company has 50% women overall, there's no reason why there shouldn't be 50% women on your executive leadership team. There's got to be barriers to why that's happening, and that's where we go in and remove them. Because a pure meritocracy would say, if you've got 50% women overall in the company, if you had a pure meritocracy, it would be likely that you'd have 50% on your executive leadership team. Otherwise, there's something going on. And we want to find um, what's going on and remove it. So,
Marilyn, I just can't agree more. You know, in the book, The Win-Win Workplace, I write one chapter on intersectional inclusion, and it's just to your point. Workers today have a diversity of experience, right? And we need to understand what are their barriers to work. And sometimes these unintended consequences that I've seen in my research. For example, you'll have an employer that will have a requirement for a 4-year degree on jobs that might not necessarily need them. But when we look at veterans, for example, and talk about, unintended impact, 2/3 of our US veterans don't have a 4-year degree. Even though they've got deep training, they've served this country, they're not eligible for these jobs, right? And so thinking about how we remove barriers and who's been impacted by them to allow people to advance, right? To bring diverse experiences. It's just so critical. And what I'm seeing that gives me hope in this moment is we're seeing a lot of employers who are going towards things like skills first hiring because they understand that a degree can be a requirement. They're
yeah.
also training hiring managers because what we've seen is even though there are people who don't have degrees, we need to make sure that hiring managers feel comfortable hiring differently and not just using a degree as a credential. And I go through other examples in the book, but really understanding who is the workforce, what are their barriers to actually being engaged in work, and as an employer, what can we do to solve that? Again, I say it's good for that worker, for the job applicant, but it's even better for the employer because now you have a deeper talent pipeline. You might not be competing for every Ivy League person, so that's going to reduce your talent cost. And you can think about how you're actually growing your own talent from the communities by which you serve and do business in.
It is a win-win. And I love your example. I want to follow up with a quick question.
Yeah.
I heard so many times from women that, for example, when I was at Cisco, there was a requirement to have an overseas rotation to get to a certain level at the VP level. But often women weren't asked, would you like an overseas rotation? Because people assumed they wouldn't, given they had a spouse and children. Did you come across that also?
Absolutely, we did. And what we found were what are things that we can do to help women? So, for example, one big lever that we saw with companies in the book, they really pushed family leave. Because when you don't have men and women having the same amount of leave, that means that one person is going to have to carry more of the caregiving responsibility. So even by small tweaks, by giving both parents, male and female leave, that has helped women advance in these companies that have had win-win. It's helped them retain women who, again, life happens. There's doctor's appointments, kids get sick. How is that burden equally shared that allows men to advance like women to advance like men do, right? Because they have a lot of them have women at home and mothers at home who are like taking those responsibilities that allow them to do an overseas rotation. And so we have to challenge all of those old workforce norms. And I
Yeah.
talk about that in the book, right? That's the zero-sum workplace. Of course, women can't travel overseas because, like, who's going to take care of the kids? We don't want to put them in a bad predicament, right? We don't need saving at this moment. What we need is just really equal benefits that allow women the same flexibility that men have had for years.
And why not ask the woman, do you want an overseas opportunity? Because often women will say, yeah, sign me up.
And this will need to be true for me to be able to do that, but I'm willing to figure that out in partnership. The question really is, do you want women to go overseas? Not do you want, like, what are you doing to ensure that all of your employees can take advantage of this opportunity?
I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah, me too. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about ERGs. So employee resource groups or employee communities. And we've seen it rise a huge kind of a big kind of tremendous emphasis on ERGs right now and how to leverage their a company's talent and specifically maybe even their diverse talent. More than kind of in the past. And so Marilyn, in our ERG guide, you say Since the inception in 1960, ERGs have become strategic assets, adding value to business success by leveraging the diverse perspectives of their members to drive market growth and ensure the relevance of new products and services. In turn, they receive leadership development and further employee engagement. So that I wanted to read that verbatim. So what tools and processes need to be put in place to do this effectively?
Well, fortunately, most companies do put processes in place. They have someone overseeing the ERGs that provides support. We have an ERG guide that lays out step by step, how do you launch them? What's the structure? How to do all of the how to put in place all of the supports needed. Strong executive sponsorship. We now have a guide for executive sponsors because so often what I experienced as a CDO was we would tap someone on the shoulder and say, will you be an executive sponsor for this group? And they said, well, of course, because I support whoever the group is. But then we didn't really tell them what the expectations were. And so they were like, they would throw money at it. They would say, I'll pay for the guest speaker, or I will buy t-shirts for everybody, things like that, because they just don't know what to do, what the clear expectations are. And I think like any role, when just like we have a guide that says, here's what the leads are for the ERG, and here's what the expectations are, we needed to do the same for an executive sponsor. So we put together a guide for executive sponsors, and we also recommend holding at least one event a year that brings together all executive sponsors, ideally twice a year, but one summit a year to say, here's the role, here's what the expectations are, what questions do you have, what help do you need, how can we support you in supporting the ERG in development, in metrics, in tying their work to the business goals, something you hit so well in your book, Angela. But that's what makes ERGs relevant, the more they can tie to the business goals. And the executive sponsor can help them do that. So all of those things are what helps them become successful. But I know you can speak a lot richly from your experience with this also.
Absolutely. And I just want to shout out a colleague who's on the line, Anastasia Talton. You know, one thing we found in our research and looking at the research out of the book is that most people are promoted into leadership or management because they're great individual contributors. They haven't really been taught how to develop people. And so one thing that we think about and what we saw, and we put this under chapter 7, developing a deep talent bench, it's exactly what you said, Marilyn. We have to train sponsors on what it means to be a sponsor. And first starting with a toolkit, really bringing them into speed about how we're thinking about strategically these ERG groups, how we see leveraging them. Because again, a lot of this has been checkbox. It's been the right thing to do. We do it because our peers do it. We don't have a full understanding of like how this impacts the business. And in the win-win workplace, the reason why I always anchor it back to how this impacts the business, because we want people and teams and leadership employers to begin measuring human resources, their people, like they measure other areas of the business. So think about how leaders are looking at their sales, they're looking at their productivity. This is happening on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. How are we thinking about how we're investing in people and the people well-being? So imagine with ERG groups, we're measuring on at least a quarterly basis, how many people out of those groups are going into management? How has this been used and tapped this body of experts to actually come up with new ideas and innovation, to think about new markets that they might have close proximity to? That's what we're seeing in the book. And we give examples of companies who are doing this, and they can actually quantify the value that their ERG group is bringing. By quantifying the value, it takes it up in importance to the rank and file, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we want to do. We want to raise the level of importance, and that's why we're measuring the output of these ERG groups.
I couldn't agree more. We were doing a webinar yesterday, and some people who are on this session were on our session yesterday, and we talked all about metrics for employee impact and metrics to the business. And we leveraged the Great Place to Work framework of internal and business metrics. But there was two quotes that we recently heard. One was great stories, open hearts, great data opens wallets. And I thought that one was so on point, because often we've erred on the side of just sharing the stories. And then a friend of mine, Guy Kawasaki, whose newsletter I subscribe to, just yesterday had this newsletter on facts tell, but stories sell. So he made an argument for the other side. So it's really, again, one of these situations where you need the story and you need the data.
It's a both and, to your point, it's not an either or. The reason why I push on the data side is because we've been so lax there with our human. We say humans are the most valuable resource, but then at the board level, do we have a scorecard and talking about, what's the well-being? What are the KPIs that we know that our people are doing well in advance? Those are the type of questions we want to evoke so that people build that muscle about really looking at the human capital and seeing that as one of their, 1 to 2 top measurements that they're looking at on a regular basis.
Exactly, because we've erred on ERGs on the side of the story, not the data. I'm 100% with you.
All right, so continuing to speak about employee engagement, and Angela, in your book, you speak about focusing on employee voices as a key to engagement, retention, and resilience. And can you share an example or two of a company that did that and what the results were?
Right. So what's interesting when we did the research for the book is when they go to any CEO or leadership team, no one will tell you that they don't listen to their employees. In fact, we know that employee listening is like $1 billion business. If you juxtapose that with the fact that when you look at US employees, upwards of 60% of them will say that their employer doesn't care about them. And so when we talk about centering employee listening, it's like closing the gap between this intention and like the felt reality from like the actual staff and workplace. And so I'll give you an example. I write about this in the book on centering worker voice. There's a company called CHI Doors, and a new management team came in, they bought the company. The company was underperforming. And so they went out to all of the employees and said, okay, do you have ideas that you can help us in areas to save money, to build new business? And they went to every single employee and asked this. And there's a story I write about. There was a delivery driver who had worked there for 7 years, grew up in the community where this manufacturing company was. And he goes, well, I've been using the GPS that I've been given on my phone, and it's been sending me on this, roundabout route that's wasting time. I could do it quicker. He's like, I've told my old manager, but no one listened. They said, if you use a different route, you'll get penalized. They took that opinion very seriously. And not only did they look at his route, they looked at all of the routes, and they found out he was right. And as we all know on this call, like a lot of us, GPS gets it wrong all of the time. What they were able to do, which was great as an outcome, is that they were able to reduce the time for delivery. They were also able to reduce gas costs when they looked at it across their entire fleet of drivers. And then I think most importantly, you had an employee there who had been there for 7 years who had stopped giving their ideas, who felt invigorated. And that program was so successful, the company decided to invest another $1 million and asked employees again, where do they think that money should go in terms of like getting the plant operating at a better speed? They gave recommendations like adding air conditioning to the plant, because what they noticed was that productivity went down in the summer, and it went down because everyone's in this hot building without, respectable AC. But things like that built trust. And the insights that they're being given from the rank and file allowed them to turn around the company. It allowed them to also, and I talk about this in chapter 9, share some of the benefits with the rank and file. So at that company, every employee received at least $50,000 from that sale, some of them upwards of $1 million. And so it's really thinking about not only do we center worker voice, but also like how do we like respect people as experts in their position to be able to contribute to strategy.
Love that. we hear some examples of that, but that's one of the best ones I've heard.
Beautiful.
Yeah, not much else to say. Look, I don't know, a heart just flew in front of my face. I have no idea why. Maybe I said love and that happened. I don't know. At least it wasn't balloons, although that would be kind of fun. Anyways, moving on. Marilyn, so our engagement survey is one way we help communities amplify employee voices. What other methods can you share that we leverage at Rise Results to impact engagement, retention, and resilience? Around we were just talking the other day about the 30, 60, 90-day response to in a survey.
Yeah, we completely, the more we talk with Angela, the more we see our alignment. But this is consistent with that, and so this is consistent with that. We believe that the engagement survey or our surveys, which can be a segment, an inclusion survey, or the full engagement survey, is one piece. That's the more quantitative data, and we slice and dice it by leader, by geography, by demographic data, all of those things. But we like to combine that with listening sessions, and we use appreciative inquiry in our listening sessions, and then that's the qualitative. And to your point, Angela, it's that combination of the quantitative and qualitative, that richness that really gives a much more full picture to the organization and to that leader to say, yes, your scores on I could speak up without fear of retribution have gone up since 6 months ago. That's great. You're still lower in one location than you are in another location. So you might want to pay a little more attention to the folks who are remote in that location. And those are all really good data points and very much based on the data. But that qualitative information, like the example you shared, where employees say, this one piece would make my job run smoother and would make the company better. Those pieces are just the highest value. And when you combine qualitative and quantitative, then the leader has a full picture to take action on. And that's where, to Kim's point, we recommend within 30 days, let them know, here, we heard you. And the language was fueled by your feedback. So we're going to start using fueled by your feedback, because often we do things in response to feedback, but we don't, we sort of let people, well, like that was my idea. And so we need to say, based on your feedback, we're taking these actions. It might not have been one person. It may have been 7 people made the suggestion, or it may have been, Joe Smith made this recommendation and we're running with it. That's the 30-day. Here's what we heard. Here's basically what we heard, and we're going to synthesize it. Within 60 days, this is what we plan to do about it. And within 90 days, we've already put these things in place, and we're going to further develop consideration on the rest of it, so that you've come back 3 times with, we heard you, we're working on it, we've already taken these action steps, and we're taking further action. So we're not letting, so often employees say to us, it's great that you're spending this time listening to us. We wish it was done before. We said this on a survey 2 years ago, no one paid attention. So it's the follow-up. It's not just fill out the survey, it's what you do with it at the end. And when you combine it with listening, or we recommend highly that leaders do skip level meetings, because the other thing we hear all the time is, the executive, the head of marketing, the head of sales, whatever, great. They do these wonderful all hands. They take all these questions. They use a framework we recommend, which is answer the question, get back to them with the answer, tell them why you can't answer it. And often you can say that I have the answer, but I can't share it. I don't, because it's a business decision we haven't made yet, and people accept that. But transparency isn't just a word you say, we're being transparent. You have to live it and action it. And so all of these things combined shift the culture to that win-win workplace that you speak so eloquently about.
Yeah, people want to know that they matter. And what you're saying is the closing of the loop is so critical. When we went out into workplaces and hard truths were delivered by one, it was a fast casual restaurant. But one thing the CEO did was he went back and said what he could do, what they couldn't do, and brought them into thinking and what we won't be able to do in this time period. And when we went back and asked employees about that, they acknowledged, well, I didn't like all the answers, but I respect that they came back to us. And what we team that is, and what we talk about in the book is like people want to know that they matter and that they're respected. And these are small things we can do that don't really take time or take money. They take time and intention. But they're high leverage. And that's why we did a study and put that in the book, because what that leads to in our research we write about is an ownership mindset. And so when employees feel like their voice is heard, that they can offer ideas, that they're actually being implemented, when they're not they're being brought into the strategy, they begin to feel like an owner of the company. And the stats that we came across is that shows that those companies who have that ownership mindset, their share prices are higher, their sales are higher, their productivity, they have less retention. And that's what we really want in this day, right? Working with the talent we have, we're trying to keep them. We want to encourage them to grow and to think like owners in terms of building the business.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way to promote innovation. I can tell you personally, when I worked at a company where my voice was not heard and no one's voice was heard, I stopped making suggestions because why bother? And that's when you get the quiet quitting notion where you get people collecting a paycheck but not really invested and doing the minimum amount until they find a new job. We're getting into a point where people are not leaving because they're afraid of their ability to find a new job. Either companies are going to engage them, listen to them, engage them, or they're going to have a lot of people who have quietly quit but still collect a paycheck.
And I think the training that you all
Not
do is
helping.
so essential because, again, I go back to the research we find, people are promoted because they're great individual contributors. How do we listen? There's a big fear when I'm talking to leaders. What if they say something that I don't think I can answer? Will I be okay? And so it feels very high stakes, but once people have the training, they're putting in the reps of doing this, especially with like, Rise Equity, the things that you're doing, we can learn to put this in practice, and that's shifting it to this win-win workplace. There's another way that we can do business with transparency, with bringing people in, and that's going to be all the more important today when, again, people aren't hiring right now. We're thinking about what we can do more with incumbent talent. Like we need to keep them at the table and engaged.
And sometimes it's just the leader says to us, I'm not meeting with my people because I don't know how to answer their questions. And all we have to do is give them that framework of, and I learned this years ago at American Express from Ken Chenault. He was brand new and he came in and he said, I'll answer any question you throw at me. My answers will be either a direct answer to the question, or I don't know, and I will get the answer and get it to you. And someone is here to take down your name and email. Or I know, but I'm unable to give you the answer because it's still in development or in flux, or it's a business situation where I'm not at liberty to share that information with you. And I thought people might bristle at that. Everyone accepted it. And it's very much like all ideas are considered, they're not all accepted. And people are okay with that too. But you considered it, you
Yeah.
heard me. And so when we help leaders understand that they can give that three answer framework, then they're like, okay, then I'll have a meeting with everyone. You mean I can listen to everyone's idea and set the expectation that I won't accept all your ideas? Oh, then I'm willing to listen. So all we have to do is help leaders understand how to do this in a way that supports their employees and doesn't set them up as in a place where they are fearful or don't know how to respond. And once we do that, they're like, oh, sure, I'm out there. I'm out there all the time now. And I love it. That's what we hear then is, I really love talking to my employees. And they do one, and then they're like, I want to do more. And then, and it's this recursive positive cycle of connection between leader and employee. And as you say, the company wins, the employee wins, and innovation flourishes in those companies, as does shareholder price and value.
Absolutely. I'm kind of stuck on a couple of things you both said. That to your point, Angela, everybody wants to feel like they matter. And then that transparency around being very clear about whether you can answer it, whether you can't, whether you know the answer and can't share. That full transparency builds trust in organizations, and leads to greater results. So with that, this is kind of an interesting question, Angela. So when we've been talking about the importance of employee voices, but how do leaders balance listening with taking decisive action, especially in times of uncertainty and crisis like we're living in now?
So the big thing we talk about listening, we have to get away with the idea that we listen once a year. We listening happens so infrequently, people think that they don't have time to listen because they think it has to be a big organized, it has to be a town hall. And we should be listening regularly, especially in this moment. Like we are in a new normal, after the pandemic, and there'll be more pandemics, there'll be more waves of things and turbulence. And so if we don't have our finger on the pulse of what's going on regularly, we're at a disadvantage as leaders. There are now the tools that we can actually do this. Some of the companies who I thought doing it well right now, they're doing weekly and monthly pulse surveys just to check in to make sure that their managers have the best information about what their employees are feeling about right now. And so the thing is, if you have to make a decisive decision, hopefully you've been doing some listening that could help inform that, but you need to make the decision. You also need to bring, and like we said, in closing the loop, as soon as that decision's made, you need to share that. You need to share the rationale behind it, and you need to get feedback on it and be prepared, right? We say feedback is a gift, but as leaders, sometimes we don't get familiar with having feedback from our direct reports or people who are lower than us. We have to raise up that psychological safety so we can actually do that listening. And sometimes we're going to hear hard truths and we're going to be okay, right? It's better to know than not to know. And that's where this whole idea of quiet quitting. People are telling you things all of the time. And so if you don't know the health, if people are pulling back, you're going to be caught, afoot, right, of not having your strategy or not having your people. So it's really important in this moment. I'm telling the leaders that I go into, communicate, be in touch with them, because in the absence of that, people are making up their stories in their mind. And typically when that happens, the stories aren't good. I was just in DC earlier this week, and everyone's watching the mass layoffs and reductions in force. If you don't think that your employees are not thinking about this, you're your eyes off the ball. Everyone's thinking about, what does this mean to me? When we see some of the most secure jobs, like government jobs, being eliminated overnight, people think, is that going to happen? What's going on? So again, we need to overly communicate, be in touch, have that open door. And again, you're going to have to make decisions, just making sure that you close the loop.
Absolutely. And I just touching on your over communicate piece, I was going to say, if nobody really likes to take surveys, right? And those engagement surveys are long and once a year, but if you're doing pulse surveys, it's equally as important to be upfront and communicate on the front end of why you're doing it, right? So your employees will fill it out because and then they trust that you're going to do something with that data. But that communication piece about why you're doing this while they're getting a pulse survey every X weeks or whatever, it's equally important, I think, to get that data.
I wanted to add one comment and really punctuate something that Angela said. I don't know about you, but I have seen too many senior executives say, I heard this and now I want to take action on it, because they don't listen because they listened once a year
Yeah.
and they heard one story from one employee. Now they want to change a whole policy or put something brand new in place because they only listened one time in 6 or 9 months. And so I think it is so, and we've lived through or been on the end at some of us who've worked in human resources on this call. I saw some of the names have been the recipients of change the policy, do this, do that. I heard this story. That's one example. But if you listen consistently over and over again to more voices, then you know if it's an isolated situation or if it's a trend. That doesn't mean you don't need to get back and close the loop, but to your point, it can't be a one and done. It has to be ongoing. And we heard this quote again at a conference Kim and I were at last week for Great Places to Work, and one of the speakers said, listening is your, right now in this climate, listening is your strategic superpower. And every leader should become a chief listening officer because it is the best thing you can do. But you can't do it once. You must do it over and over and over again. So in this current environment, as Kim started us off in the post-pandemic global craziness that we're going through, listening is critical.
And I want to give it just a quick example. I know we're coming up on time, but I was with the CEO of a bank, and they were discussing with the leadership team and the board their return to office strategy. And the CEO said, what I've heard, I said, well, do we know why, employees don't want to return to work? And he goes, what I've been talking to with my direct reports, they've said, a lot of people like working at home or familiar. I was like, but have we asked them why they don't return to work? And he goes, we really haven't. And then after the meeting, he pulls me aside and was like, I think we need to do that. I was like, I think you need to do too. And he went out and he actually did the listening. And what they found out was that people didn't want to return to work, not just because they liked working at home, but it was traffic. It was the amount of time that they were spending on their commute. It was the amount of money they were spending when they came into the office versus making a sandwich at home. And so it just illuminated for him having a more nuanced conversation around the return to work. And what he and his leadership team were able to do was say, okay, we wanted people back in 5 days. How can we be flexible? How can we think about that time where we're asking people to be in the office and be really intentional about that? Because that was the other feedback. We don't want to go in if we're going to be on Zoom talking to people or having noise canceling headsets on. And so by doing that, he was able to engage them, but that data actually changed his mind. And I think it's really important to hear from rank and file because sometimes what you said, Marilyn, having those skip level meetings, like you really need to hear from the people directly so something's not lost in translation.
Yeah, because returning to work is a great example. How that impacts senior leaders is very different from how that impacts first level employees. It's a different financial commitment and it's a very different social or socioeconomic difference, but a very big difference in every element. If you're going to sit in a bullpen scenario with little cube dividers, that's very different scenario coming into the office and having a hard time concentrating from coming into the office with a real office and the burden of the commute, the financial, and all those other things you mentioned. So yeah, very different perspectives depending on who you listen to.
Who you listen to. Another example I'll just share who's doing this well is LinkedIn. And so when they're thinking about their return to office, what they want to do is go to the rank and file and say, we want to be intentional. We're not coming back 5 days a week, but we want to be intentional that if we bring people back, what does that need to look like? And so they went and surveyed rank and file employees before coming up with their policy. The other thing that they thought about was reimagining the workspace itself. And so do we need those cubicles? What's the design that we can create that will allow people to actually interact that makes this time in the office beneficial? But I've been touting the way that they've approached this is just a model for folks to think about. Even for the CEO I was talking about of this financial institution, we're bringing people back in. What needs to be true in that space so people can do their best work and actually collaborate?
Great. Well, I'm going to do two more questions and then we'll get to audience questions. But the next one is for both of you. So what role do middle managers play in either amplifying or muting an employee voice, and how can organizations better equip them for that responsibility? And I asked this question because our webinar yesterday, we spent some time talking about middle management and the importance of them. So and getting them on board. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to start this too. I write this on the book, How Do We Transition Frontline Managers to Frontline Leaders? And I'll give a quick story. I think all of us saw the headlines when Jamie Dimon had a town hall meeting. Someone stood up and asked about the return to office policy. Jamie was not having his best day and kind of overreacted. That was interesting. But what happened after that is the person who asked the question, he went back and with his manager, and his manager was like, "You're fired, pack your bags and leave." Not that Jamie Dimon told this manager to fire him, but the manager thought, in what I call the zero-sum workplace, if you do something that upsets the big boss, then you automatically have to go. And I use that example is because this person was invited into a town hall, was given the opportunity and asked to ask questions. And because it upset, the CEO, chairman, now he gets fired by his manager. They end up rectifying that, but we have to train managers in a new way because how someone experiences a job is directly impacted by who they report to. And I've said this once and twice before, people get promoted because they're great individual contributors. We don't do enough to actually train managers. And also what we saw in this book is, and I did one case study on a global financial firm, they came to the understanding that everyone's not meant to be managers. And so they're rethinking, how do we promote people and advance people that maybe doesn't include managing people, because that's important as well. And so I think we need to think about how we move people into management. We need to think about how we train them to be managers. And then third, thinking about how we promote people without saying that it necessarily has to be tied to managing people.
I agree with everything. And I will say in the tech sector, where I've spent a good portion of my career, what we found is that people were promoted because the company grows like Topsy and you just need more managers. And so you take your best whatever and they become a manager. What doesn't happen is what you mentioned, the training. The second thing that doesn't happen is they don't have the ability to spend time managing. So what we see is that most first level managers still carry workload of the people who report to them. So if they're doing marketing, they're still doing marketing. If they're doing coding, they're still doing coding. If they're working in AI, they're still working in AI. They still have project work in addition to their supervisory responsibilities. And because they've excelled at their project work, that's what got them the promotion. That's their comfort zone. So they spend 95 to 98% of their time on the project stuff and 2% of the time on the management role, because that's stuff they don't know how to do. They haven't been trained in it. It's not their core necessarily. Some of them shouldn't be managers, to your point. And so what we need to do a few things. One, we need to train them, as you said. Two, we need to make sure that their job description carves out at least a quarter of their time to a third to be supporting and developing others. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. If they're not developing the first line folks are not going to get developed, and that's your workforce. So their role has to be as a developer of talent, and we need to train them how to do it, and then we need to give them the time to do it. And then we need to reward them for doing it. So their performance reward system needs to be based on how they develop others, how they lead others, and the performance of their team, not their. But right now, most systems rate managers on what their team's outputs are. So the manager says, well, if my team didn't get enough outputs, I'll do the outputs. And again, that pushes them toward the 95% worker bee on what they used to do. So the whole system needs to be modified to push toward development of talent, not, which is the manager role, not doing the job. And that system, and I saw that when I started in 2000 at Cisco, coming from American Express, where that was our system, where I led learning and development, and that was the whole system. But when I went into the tech industry, I realized there were no development plans. And now that's changed over time. And Cisco has a robust development process, but that's typically what's missing. It's just not set up for success. And so we need to give managers the time and the skills to develop their team, to listen, but also to develop their team. And that's what people are craving. They want to, they don't want to be stagnant. You hired them with a certain set of skills, they want to grow them. And they want to be able to move laterally within the company because, as you said earlier, let's face it, we're not hiring in, we're moving laterally.
It's so funny. I always say, managing people is one job you're not paid for, and you're so right on the compensation piece. We signal what's important by what we measure, right? And the responsibility and the time. And, one is also asking managers, how are they improving on their own management practices, right? What are you doing outside to be skilled up? So training people and then asking them to continue to upskill to think about this. Because the more information, we have so much information out there, just making that a norm that managers are, expected to lean in this way.
And are the VPs training the managers, or the directors training the managers, or the VPs training the directors? It has to keep cascading up.
Yes.
I know we've over talked for you a little bit, Kim. So
No, I love it. I love the
Okay.
conversation. The last question is for you, Angela, and then I just want to get to at least maybe one of the questions in the Q&A. So following up, I'd like to close with your 5 actions leaders must take now to protect both their employees and their company that you cover in your book. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we're really thinking about, in addition to researching, employers, we've just talked to employees from all over the country, red states, blue states, at all levels. A lot of folks who have barriers to work, we're in the sandwich generation today where we're caring for elders and for our children. The biggest thing, and we've talked about this throughout this session, is we have to do more deep listening. Based on that listening, we need to be in a mindset and understanding that there needs to be a reimagining of the workplace. I'm not saying throw everything out, but a lot of times employees will hear, we can't change it because that's the way we've always done it. This is a new time. And it's not an unprecedented time. And so really thinking about employers who are willing to relook at all of these norms. Some of them you'll keep, some of them you'll reimagine, but we should really be thinking about that. The third thing that we want to do is, and we've talked about this again, is just the communication piece. How are you normalizing that? How are you incentivizing that? What are the vehicles that you have to actually do it? Is it technology? How are you closing the loop? We've got generative AI now. We're seeing a lot of the companies that we talked about in the book that are using that. They're using it as a sandbox to make meaning of the listening they have. They're also using it as a sandbox because they want their employers to engage with this, to think about how they're adding value with that piece. The fourth thing leaders should think about is, how are you benchmarking with your peers? You talked about going to top places to work. This is the time now to really align and understand what your peers are doing. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because despite all the headlines, there are companies who are doubling down in talent. Those are the ones that are trying to take your A players. For example, Spotify had a billboard in Times Square that said, we let our employees work remote because we hire adults. Why are they doing that in New York? Because they know there's a lot of A talent there, and they know a lot of people are being forced back to work that might be looking for their next opportunity. Remember, A talent always has optionality. The fifth thing I would say in this moment is to take care of yourselves. We also know, and it's just what you said, Marilyn, we're working, we're doing our job, we're managing other people. We need to lift up and make sure that we're able to take time for ourselves and take time for our people.
Yeah, I have no idea why. I do love what you just said, but another heart went in front of my face. So with that, we have 4 minutes left. So Alicia, can you take yourself off mute and just share one of the questions that we've gotten in the chat or in the Q&A?
Sure, happy to.
So, thanks.
So this one is circling back around to the concept of ERGs as business drivers. Christine asks, what are some lessons learned that you've seen from ERGs that have transitioned from being support groups to being strategic business assets, sharing their insights to contribute to business strategy and operational effectiveness?
Well,
Or why don't we jump in?
Here, when we hear these all the time, companies we work with, this is one of the big pushes that we do as we work with company ERGs. One of the big things we like to do is reframe the ERGs to be business drivers. And so they start thinking about how could they, or the affiliation that they represent, think about the business in a new way to enhance either a business, an adjacency or a new client base. And so one business went out to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and invited them to come in and learn about the opportunities that the business had. Just invited the members of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce in for a meeting at the company, sort of coffee and tea and learn about what the business could do for that community. Another business said, we realized that we needed to do some translation of some of our materials into language that's more consistent with this community there are many in the community that don't have fluency in English. So, and the people in that community offered to rewrite some of the things in the right dialect. Another company, they said, we will help train the customer service reps when they get a call of someone who needs help in a language that's not one of our standards. We have people in our employee resource groups who are volunteering to help do one-on-one translation. That's unheard of when most of this stuff is automated, but those things not only make those employees feel like they're making a difference, but they've opened up huge new markets. I can tell you, when I was doing this work at Cisco, we measured the difference in sales made when women were on the sales executive presentation briefing team and when they weren't, and we had a 17% lift. That one data point could have funded all my ERGs for 2 years because that was a huge number. We also had, just one thing like that with one data point can make a huge difference.
Great, thank you. I want to give you a chance to answer too, Angela.
No, I love that. And I'm going to have to write about that, Marilyn, because I think that's such a great example. The other two companies that I look at around this are AXA Equitable and BNP. And one thing they've done with their ERG groups is they've given them innovation funds to tackle a problem or practice that the company is facing. And so again, acknowledging the expertise that they bring, that they have a viewpoint on the populations, different populations that could be served. And out of that, that, and we've seen more and more companies that are thinking of doing things like this, they're really tackling problems that they see from their seat. And that's exciting because that returns real value to the company. And again, it raises the level. It gives these ERG, the folks in there who've been doing the hard work, a chance to present to leadership. Another example of a company that's doing that is, Coca-Cola bottlers that are out of North Carolina. They did the same thing. They're having a challenge around their frontline workers and retaining them. And so what they did with the ERG group, they said, we want you to put together a business plan from this ERG group to help us address this issue. Come to us with the research, with the plan, and then once we approve of the plan, we'll give you dollars if it's approved to execute on it. But it's a different level, and the way that they're seeing it is their leadership to pipeline. So they're able to see people's thinking. They're spending time on real business issues that have a tangible impact on the overall bottom line.
Great. Well, with that, thank you. If you're still on, thank you for staying 1 minute over. If you'd like to learn more about Angela's work, we're going to put up a slide that has all of the contact information. This will also be followed up in an email to you with a link to this recording as well. So with that, I will say the 3 words that kind of resonated with me were, well, listen, listen, listen is one. And then measuring, the importance of measuring, and then acting on that. And so Angela's book's full of incredible examples, and you can explore her 9 principles further by checking out her book. So with that, I'll say thank you so much, Dr. Angela Jackson and Marilyn Nagel, for your time. I know it's a time, it's hard to get an hour out of your busy day. So thank you so much for being here. For those on the call, thank you for being a part of our community. And thank you for taking an hour out of your busy day as well. And there goes another heart. I have no idea why, but
I love it though. Thank you.
happy Thursday.
Thank you, everyone. Good to be with you today.